Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, December 19th, 2022. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Henry Kissinger calls for a negotiated peace in Ukraine to avoid a world war. So, this is the second time in recent months that Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, has made headlines for calling for peace talks to end the war in Ukraine. And, as a lot of people have pointed out, when Henry Kissinger sounds like the voice of reason, we know that we're in trouble. Um, so he came out again in favor of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine in an article that he wrote for The Spectator titled How to Avoid Another World War. So in the article, Kissinger said that, he has expressed his support for the allied military effort to thwart Russia, but that he believes there is now room for negotiations. He wrote, quote, "The time is approaching to build on the strategic changes which have already been accomplished and to integrate them into a new structure towards achieving peace through negotiation," end quote. So Kissinger, he angered officials in Ukraine and hawks in Washington back in May when he suggested that Ukraine should cede Crimea and territory that the Donbass separatists controlled before the February 24th invasion to achieve peace. Basically, he suggested that Ukraine should accept those, the post 2014 lines as a way to spur peace talks and reach a ceasefire. So in his essay, which was published on Saturday in The Spectator, Kissinger suggested a similar idea, although he said that Ukraine could no longer be neutral and must be aligned with NATO, which is a proposal I would have a hard time believing that Russia would get on board with, at least at this point. So he wrote, quote, "NATO has acquired one of the largest and most effective land armies in Europe, equipped by America and its allies. A peace process should link Ukraine to NATO, however expressed. The alternative of neutrality is no longer meaningful, especially after Finland and Sweden joined NATO," end quote. So that seems to be a shift in his older position that he believes Ukraine should not be aligned with the West and NATO. And that's a position he's held for a long time. So the former Secretary of State suggested that referendums could be held to settle disputes over some of the territory that Russia has captured from Ukraine. So this is interesting. He's suggesting internationally mediated or internationally supervised referendums in, the Donbass and I guess in Kherson and Zaporozhye as well. So he wrote, quote, "If the pre-war dividing line between Ukraine and Russia cannot be achieved by combat or by negotiation, recourse to the principle of self-determination could be explored. Internationally supervised referendums concerning self-determination could be applied to particularly divisive territories which have changed hands repeatedly over the centuries," end quote. So Kissinger said that the goal of peace in Ukraine should be to secure Ukraine's freedom and to define a new international structure that Russia could eventually join. And he said that he disagrees with the idea that Russia should be rendered impotent by the war, which is a common view among hawks in Washington. They want Russia to be defeated. Henry Kissinger does not agree. He said, quote, "For all its propensity to violence, Russia has made decisive contributions to the global equilibrium and to the balance of power for over half a millennium. Its historical role should not be degraded," end quote. So, I mean, Kissinger doesn't really want to talk about a propensity towards violence. Ukrainian officials insist that they can defeat Russia, but Kissinger recognized that even if Moscow's conventional capabilities are weakened, it still has a vast nuclear arsenal. So Kissinger, while he is most known as being a hawk, and mostly due to his infamous role in leading the secret U.S. bombing campaign of Cambodia when he was President Nixon's national security advisor. He has long called for a more friendly posture toward Russia since the end of the Cold War. In 2014, shortly after the U.S. backed ousting of former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, Kissinger warned that if Ukraine were to survive and thrive, which is how he put it, he said Ukraine must function as a bridge between Russia and the West. Unfortunately, Kissinger's new call for peace in Ukraine comes as the prospect of negotiations to end the fighting are very bleak. Ukrainian officials still maintain that their goal is to drive Russia out of all the areas that it has captured in Ukraine, as well as Crimea, while Russia insists that it is not leaving the territories it has annexed. And the US and NATO are making plans to support Ukraine's military for years and years to come. So I could go on about how there are many examples that show, the idea of peace talks happening right now. Unfortunately, we saw some signs back in October, November that maybe, there's more dialogue between the U.S. and Russia. Maybe talks are possible, but I think we've kind of lost any hope now, just the way things have been going. But who knows? There's always a chance of backdoor negotiations happening. Hopefully, there is more back channel communication than we realize. But right now, things aren't looking too good. All right, the next article here, this is from Kyle Anzalone. He wrote this up on Friday. And this is based on a report from NBC News. The U.S. believes that Ukraine can retake Crimea, but they recognize that it may provoke a nuclear escalation. So the White House believes that Ukraine's military has the capability to retake Crimea, which for me is a little hard to believe because they still have a long way to go, through Kherson before getting there. But these U.S. officials who spoke with NBC News, they said that the Biden administration, while they do believe Ukraine could retake Crimea and nominally back that goal, they recognize that it could lead to nuclear war. So, according to the NBC News report, these statements were made by the administration to Congress during a hearing last month. The administration official was attempting to explain to Congress why Kiev still needs American support. So that was basically the point of this hearing. So Kyle just gives a little background that Crimea was a region of Ukraine before it was annexed by Russia in 2014. And even though a referendum of Crimean citizens backed joining Russia, and this isn't just a referendum from 2014 when Russia took it, polling before that time and after has shown that people of Crimea wanted to join Russia and that they're happy that they did. But self-determination is not important to the U.S. when it comes to these areas because the U.S. has never recognized it as Russian, and of course, neither has Kiev. So sources reached by NBC News said that the White House believes Putin will respond sharply to a successful Ukrainian offensive in Crimea, saying that it's a red line for Russia, and believing that if it happens, it could lead to nuclear war. So at least they do recognize that a full-blown offensive against Crimea is a red line for Russia. So hopefully that means that the U.S. won't be trying to support anything like that, although we have seen them shift, and it looks like they are supporting attacks inside Russia, which could also lead to a major escalation. Now, this next article here, one killed in Ukrainian shelling of Russia's Belgorod region. So Belgorod is a region that borders Ukraine. It's near the Kharkiv region. It borders that region, which Ukraine controls most of now. So one civilian was killed and another 8 people were wounded, and a poultry farm was damaged in Ukrainian shelling in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. And this is according to the region's governor. He said this on Sunday, so it looks like the shelling was on Sunday. So this region, Belgorod of Russia, has come under attack throughout the war. But the reason this is the first attack, there was one earlier in December, but the first one with reported casualties since November 15th. So the reason why I wanted to highlight this though was because it did come after this report from the Times of London that said the Pentagon now tacitly backs Ukrainian strikes inside Russian territory. Although at this point there's no indication that U.S. weapons were used in the attack on Belgorod, but it's certainly in range. I believe the city. I don't have this in front of me, but I think the city of Belgorod is about 22 miles from the Ukrainian border. So the U.S. HIMARS rocket launchers could target that area. Even, some of the howitzers that the US has sent could hit targets in the region because, if they could go right up to the border, then they could strike right into Russia from there. And also, there has been a shift in how the US views what Ukraine does with its weapons that it provides. Because when the U.S. first sent these HIMARS rocket launch systems, which are equipped with missiles that have a range of up to 50 miles, the Biden administration said that it received assurances that Ukrainian forces won't use them inside Russian territory. But the U.S. no longer appears to be concerned about how the weapons are used. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, he said last week that when we give Ukraine a weapon system, it belongs to them and they decide how and where they use it. And that is a shift in policy. Kind of something that went underreported, I think, was that the administration is saying that now. That yeah, we give it to them, they could use it however they want. And the Times report said that the U.S. was basing this change in policy on the fact that Russia hasn't used nuclear weapons or attacked a NATO country yet. I mean, that's it. That's all they're basing it on is the fact that up to this point, Putin hasn't responded to attacks on Russian territory by attacking NATO or using a nuke. That's it. But he hasn't responded to attacks on Crimea and other Russian territory by destroying Ukraine's energy infrastructure, decimating the power grid. Ukrainian officials say half of it has been destroyed. That's just what they're saying publicly. It could be a worse situation. So it's been detrimental to Ukrainian civilians, but that doesn't seem to matter much to the U.S. Okay, so the next article here, this is from Vox, and it's about a D.C. party, an event in Washington, D.C. that was hosted by the Ukrainian embassy. And it was an event commemorating the 31st anniversary of the Ukrainian armed forces. And on this invitation, this is really something. Um, it listed the sponsors of the event, which included Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and Lockheed Martin. So it just really what this article is about is that this one, invite, it shows that, who's making the money off of the war in Ukraine. And it says the quiet part out loud. So I just thought that was interesting. I mean, that's really the story here is that this invite, just had these arms makers right on it, front and center, not trying to hide, what this is really all about. All right, so the next article here, moving over to some China stuff. The State Department launches a new China House office to focus on Beijing policy. So the State Department announced this on Friday that they're opening this new office to coordinate China policy, and they're calling it China House. And this is the Biden administration's latest effort to focus on Beijing. So, in a press release, the State Department said that the new office is meant to help the U.S. government responsibly manage competition with China. So, this kind of reflects that the Biden administration's view on China, which we've seen in all the statements and just press releases about how the U.S., how the Biden administration is approaching the relationship with China, and that is they're approaching it as a managing of tensions. They're not expecting those tensions to ease, but they want to manage them to support, to prevent that things really spiraling out of control, rather than working to actually resolve issues between the U.S. and China. So the State Department said in this press release that announced China House that it was part of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's modernization policy for the State Department to meet the challenges of the decades ahead. So it reaffirmed that China is the administration's top foreign policy priority by labeling Beijing as what they called the most complex and consequential geopolitical challenge that the U.S. faces. The department said that the China House will bring together a group of China experts from the State Department and also from other U.S. departments, federal agencies, and even beyond that, just to deal with issues related to Beijing. So, other federal agencies have also opened new offices to focus on Beijing, including the CIA. The CIA opened a China center last year. And at the very beginning of the Biden administration, I mean, because I was following, the forming of the Biden administration during all the Senate hearings, it was very clear, despite kind of the Republican talking point that Biden is weak on China, it was very clear that his administration was going to make confronting China and being tough on China a priority. And just a few days after Biden was sworn in, there was a report in Politico that said the National Security Council restructured to shift its focus away from conflicts in the Middle East toward countering China in the Asia Pacific. So that goes to show what a priority this is, that the National Security Council was shifted around. They put more positions focused on China and the Asia Pacific than the Middle East. All right. So the next one here, the US is not the only one saying that its priority is to confront China. Japan, in a new national security strategy, calls China an unprecedented challenge. So Japan released a new military strategy on Friday, which labeled China as an unprecedented challenge and outlined a major overhaul of Japan's military that marks the biggest shift away from Tokyo's post World War II policy of pacifism. So this I've been covering this, and this includes Kishida, the Japanese prime minister. He recently announced the goal to increase Japan's military spending to over 2% of the country's GDP by 2027. Or I said over 2%, but he wants it to be about 2% of the country's GDP by 2027. And this would more than double Tokyo's defense budget, based on the spending plan that he's outlined. So this strategy document kind of formalizes that this is what the Japanese government is going to strive to do. And based on Japan's current GDP, the plan would make Japan's defense spending about $80 billion per year, which is the third highest military budget. It would make it the third highest military budget in the world. The US right now, the NDAA that they just passed is well over $850 billion. So US is clearly number one. China, I believe, I should have put this in here, but I have a link to a Wall Street Journal article that has the information. But China's military spending is around 250 billion, I want to say. So this would put, just over 250 billion. So this would put Japan ahead of India. I mean, India is just such a huge country that it really shows how much Japan is going to be spending. And part of this plan, and a huge part of this plan, and this is the real big change, is that Japan is going to buy long range missiles, US made Tomahawk missiles, which have a range of over 1,000 miles. So acquiring weapons like that, it means that they could hit targets in mainland China and also North Korea. And its official policy, the Japanese defense forces, self-defense forces as they're called, the purpose of Japan's military post-World War II is supposed to be for self-defense, and they're not supposed to be able to strike other countries, but that's going to change with these missiles. Now, I mean, Japan has a big military, even though it is already as it is, even though it is in the name of self-defense. But this still is a pretty major change. And this has been encouraged by the U.S. They want Japan to really build up their military. Of course, they want to encircle China more, and they want their allies to pitch in and really, do their part. And the way that this document words this, they call China, according to the English translation, they call China the biggest strategic challenge, unlike anything we have seen before. So this reflects language from US military documents and other US strategy documents. And the key to the US strategy to counter China and all the things that they've been putting out is increasing cooperation with allies in the region and building up alliances. So Japan is going to really fit into this plan. And, if a war does break out in Asia between the US and China, if it stays conventional, it doesn't go nuclear, which it could pretty quickly. It's going to be the people of Taiwan and the people of Japan and Okinawa again uh, are going to be the ones really suffering and bearing the brunt of a war like that. So I wish people in Japan would keep that in mind. That they might be the ones really doing the fighting and dying in a war between the U.S. and China. And of course, China has criticized the Japanese security plan, saying that it is harmful to China-Japan relations. Of course, they're not happy about it because Japan here they're embarking on this huge military buildup, and they're saying it's because of China. So, um, it is provocative toward Beijing, and Japan says they have to do it because of tensions over Taiwan. Japan's presence in the East China Sea, closer to Japanese claimed territory, and things like that. And also North Korea, the tensions over there. All right, the next article here, the U.S. launches more airstrikes in Somalia, probably the most underreported war, at least in Western media. So U.S. Africa Command said on Sunday in a press release that it launched 2 airstrikes in Somalia in the month of December so far that targeted al-Shabaab fighters. And they said these were launched in support of the U.S.-backed Mogadishu-based government. One strike took place on December 14th, and the other took place on December 17th. In the 2 strikes combined, they said 15 al-Shabaab fighters were killed. They were both launched in about central Somalia, northeast of Mogadishu. I should have put a map in here of Somalia. But that's where a lot of the fighting has been between the government and al-Shabaab. And the government has also been using militias on the ground that aren't part of the government, because it's important to note that the Mogadishu government doesn't control all of Somalia. In fact, they don't control very much of it. So they're using, but they're allying with these other militias to fight al-Shabaab. So in both strikes, of course, AFRICOM claimed in its initial assessment that there were no civilian casualties. But we have to always keep in mind that the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, especially in Somalia. And there's virtually no accountability for U.S. airstrikes in the country because the war is severely underreported. When I wrote this up, I think there has been, I don't know if there's been any coverage of it. I got this from AFRICOM's press release. Unfortunately, that's the only thing I have to work with here. There's little reporting from the ground that makes it our way, that filters to the Western media. So Biden has escalated the air war in Somalia since he ordered the deployment of up to 500 troops to the country back in May. And in recent months, the Somali government of President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed has been seeking more U.S. support as it has launched offensives against al-Shabaab. There's been a lot of fighting on the ground. And besides stepping up drone strikes in Somalia, the U.S. is also increasing the training of Somali forces. So BBC reported in November that the Danab Brigade, which is a commando force of Somalis that's trained by the U.S., is set to grow from, it's currently 1,500 fighters, and they're going to grow to more than 3,000. So they're going to double in size in the coming months as the U.S. is increasing funding and military support for this group, the Danab. So that's another way that the U.S. is escalating its involvement in the war in Somalia. All right, the next article here, the head of the CIA, William Burns, he says that Russia and Iran are building how he put it, a full-fledged defense partnership. So he said this in an interview with PBS that aired on Friday. So the U.S., they keep warning about this growing ties between Russia and Iran. And as an example of their growing military cooperation, he cited Iran supplying Russia with drones. And for their part, Iran has insisted that they only provided Russia with drones before the invasion of Ukraine. And Moscow claims that these kamikaze drones that they're using against Ukrainian infrastructure aren't Iranian, even though they, based on what the Ukrainian government is saying, and Western officials are saying that they are Iranian drones. But who knows exactly what's happening with that. But Burns, He said, quote, "The Russians are beginning to look at ways in which technologically or technically they can support the Iranians, which poses real threats to Iran's own neighborhood, to many of our friends and partners in Iran's neighborhood as well," end quote. So he's saying this cooperation is a threat to the US and its allies in the Middle East. And Iran, hit back at his comments and said that they would not seek permission from anybody to expand ties with Russia, basically saying it's nobody's business and that it's not meant to be against any other countries. So this was Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Nasir Kanani, and he accused the U.S. of making baseless political claims. He said that they're all part of Washington's propaganda war against the Islamic Republic, which there certainly is a propaganda war against Iran in the West, driven a lot by Israel and Saudi Arabia. But there's no doubt that the Iran and Russia are increasing cooperation, and this is a result of the U.S. policy of the U.S. targeting both countries with sanctions. They sanction these countries, they isolate Iran's economy. Naturally, before even the U.S. really started sanctioning Russia the way that they have since the invasion, Iran has turned to these countries, Russia and China, that can help them out, give them relief, that don't really have to worry about U.S. sanctions. And you see this example between Russia and China. Historically, they haven't been that close militarily, Russia and China, but we've seen them over recent years really increase military drills together. And again, it's a result of this common pressure that they're facing from the West. And the U.S. acts surprised that this happens when it's just so obvious from any other observer that what this would lead to. Although it's important to point out that China has recently reaffirmed that they would not provide Russia with weapons for the war in Ukraine. They haven't given them any support like that, and they have been calling for negotiations to end the war. All right, the last news story that we have here, this is from Middle East Eye, and it's about Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company. Unilever, their parent company, has settled the Ben & Jerry's lawsuit over sales in occupied Palestinian territory. So there's a whole drama with Ben & Jerry's that started in 2021. They announced that they were going to stop selling their ice cream in settlements in the West Bank. And I followed the story really closely because it showed the Israeli reaction, and it showed something about laws that American states have on the books against BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, a global movement that calls to boycott, Israeli products made in West Bank in illegal settlements to pressure Israel. So about 30, I believe it's 30 U.S. states have anti-BDS laws on the books. And because Ben & Jerry's decided to stop selling in West Bank settlements, Israel pressured American governors of states, to take action against Unilever, which is the parent company of Ben & Jerry's. So this story really shows uh, how these laws, which really go against the First Amendment, can really threaten American companies. So Ben & Jerry's is based in Vermont, and Unilever is a British conglomerate which bought them out, I believe, around 2000. So I guess you could argue that Ben & Jerry's isn't an American company, but to us it is. It was started it's based in Vermont. But a few states took action against Ben & Jerry's, against Unilever, over them not selling in the West Bank, in the settlements. And they divested pension funds, state pension funds. I know the states that took action include New Jersey, Texas, Florida, New York was heading in that direction, and a few other states. So it shows, on behalf of a foreign power, they're punishing an American company or a British conglomerate for the actions of their American subsidiary. And so there was a lawsuit because Unilever tried to sell Ben & Jerry's Israel to an Israeli company, and apparently and Ben & Jerry's wasn't happy about it, so they sued Unilever. I hope this isn't too much in the weeds, this story here. But just to make a long story short, the lawsuit is apparently over, and it looks like Ben & Jerry's has sold, its Israeli operations have been sold to an Israeli company. According to the Electronic Intifada, Israel is no longer listed on the company's website, on Ben & Jerry's website, of where it operates. And this is sold. It says that Unilever has sold trademark rights to Hebrew and Arabic language versions of the Ben and Jerry's name to Blue and White Ice Cream Limited. So I guess that's the operations now. So anyway, again, just the reason why I followed this story closely is because those anti-BDS laws are very they're bad news and just totally go against the First Amendment. All right, so that's it for the news for today. We have a great original viewpoint from our columnist Ted Snyder about the troubled U.S.-Saudi relationship, which you could go check out. We linked to one from James Carden over at Responsible Statecraft about diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia, and he looks back on diplomacy during the Cold War. And he mentions Lynn Tracy. She was just confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to Russia back in November, which I actually missed. And I don't know too much about her. So he gets a little into her background. So go check that out. We linked to one from Caitlin Johnstone about NATO warning about a war between the U.S. and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and how the U.S. basically is green lighting, Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory, which is very concerning. So go check that out. And our spotlight is from the Electronic Intifada from Maureen Claire Murphy about how Israel sinks to a new low by smearing slain children as terrorists. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention too is that I never really talk about what we have in our blog, but we also have a ton of content over there if you want to go check that out. I mean, we have one thing we do is we just put out a ton of content at antiwar.com. Just because you listen to the show, doesn't mean you shouldn't go visit the website. But that's it for me for today. Hopefully I didn't go too long. Support the show, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube and all that good stuff. But I will talk to you tomorrow with more news. Thanks for listening.